How happy are you with your government's position on China?
Well, look, I think it's really important for policymakers to recognise the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. Over the last 10 years, China has racked up a huge trust deficit, not just in our region, but across the globe. And I think for policymakers here in the UK and Australia, the single biggest foreign policy challenge in the next decade and beyond is China and how we deal with it. And so my argument for the last 5 or 6 years is that Australia has to assert its sovereignty. Its digital sovereignty through the 5G program that we're rolling out. We excluded Huawei. We advocated for the UK to do the same. We've got to protect critical infrastructure like ports. You might have seen a decision around the Port of Darwin over the last week or so where the Albanese government chose not to divest a Chinese business of the lease that they entered into.
Your party would?
Our party was certainly going to review it, and we'd be very tough about it. There's a geopolitical structural challenge, and that is that there is increasing competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We're a small middle power, and we have a deep relationship with the United States and now the UK as well through AUKUS. China, of course, is revisionist. It wants to upend the global rules-based order. It's also expansionist, and we see that through militarisation of the South China Sea, through the islands there. We see it through their economic aims, through the Belt Road Initiative. I think we really need to be clear-eyed about China, its long-term aims, and essentially the challenge it poses to free peoples.
If you want to be clear-eyed about China, does it help to go to Beijing and meet the leadership? Does that help you to see clearly?
Well, my view is you should always talk to everyone.
So no controversy about that. You don't object to Mr Albanese going to Beijing?
Of course not. And it's good that he's maintaining a relationship with China. You've got to remember that it was China who froze out our Prime Minister and the coalition government over the last 5 or 6 years. So a restoration of relations is a good thing, but we have to be clear-eyed about it. Of course, our Prime Minister is in the United States with President Biden, and President Biden and his officials have warned us about the challenge of China. And so we need to make sure that we uphold our sovereignty, that we make very clear our position of disagreement with China, but also we have a strong and deep trade relationship with China, and that's why it's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah. What conversation should Mr Albanese have in Beijing, do you think?
Well, we've had a number of Australians detained for some time by China. We had an Australian journalist, Ching Li, released just recently. There's another gentleman who's being held. We should fight for those people. We should make very clear that we are unhappy with that situation.
And at a more strategic level, what would the conversation be?
Well, I think like Rishi Sunak did, making it very clear that espionage and foreign interference is something that we take very seriously. In 2018, we introduced landmark laws to defend Australia's sovereignty from increased espionage and foreign interference. So I think that needs to be an ongoing part of the conversation, because as our security chiefs have warned us, espionage and foreign interference in Australia is at unprecedented levels, exceeding that of the Cold War.
There's a certain theory running around that with the world so distracted by 2 major wars, and with the United States running up to a presidential election with the 2 candidates that there are likely to be, that this could be a moment for China to act over Taiwan. Do you share that fear?
I do share that fear. I think President Xi has made it very clear that reunification with Taiwan is his strategic aim, and we need to be prepared to impose cost if such action is taken.
What cost?
Well, that'll be decided by the governments of the day. But this is deterrence theory. We can't afford to have...
But deterrence doesn't work if the party taking the action doesn't know what the cost is.
Well, and this is the challenge for policymakers like me, for the Australian government, for the UK government. Anyone who wants to uphold free peoples like the Taiwanese...
Do you think if you were in office you would like to define what the cost would be to China so that they would understand the deterrence?
I think what we're doing through AUKUS is lifting our own military capability. I think we'll have a greater presence in the region, which will contribute to collective security in our region, and that's very, very important. That's why the US and the UK are such important partners in the Indo-Pacific. I know the UK has a lot to focus on with Russia and Ukraine and Europe generally, but it's really important that we have policymakers, people like Tom Tugendhat, who's been very solid on China, are focused on the Indo-Pacific region. And Michael, it's great to have Johnny Mercer out to Perth very recently. And again, just seeing UK policymakers come out, see the geography for themselves and understand the challenges that we face as a country.
Yeah, I entirely sympathise with that point. I mean, it may seem very odd, but just by being on a different spot on the globe, we begin to see things from a different perspective. You mentioned Ukraine in passing there. Are you satisfied with the amount of support that is being given by the Australian government to the Ukrainians?
I think we can do more. I think if you look at Ukraine, in a sense, that's a Western front. If you look at Taiwan, that's an Eastern front. And it's really, really important that Russia has a great cost imposed on them for this unilateral, unprovoked, unjust war against the Ukrainian people, because it sends a message to other authoritarian powers who might take on military adventures of their own.
I mean, I talked about fears. There is obviously a very widespread fear now that the focus of the West, if I can call it that, on Israel versus Hamas is taking away focus from Ukraine, Russia. Not only focus, actually, but support. I mean, weaponry, shells that may have been destined for Ukraine may now be diverted. Do you share that worry?
I do. I think free countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, the US, we need to start investing more in our military munitions. I think it's really important, particularly as they get run down supporting the war in Ukraine. And, of course, the attacks, the brutal attacks by Hamas on the Israeli people just remind us that the barbarians are back and we need to be prepared to defend ourselves.
I mean, it would be a sorry state of affairs, wouldn't it, if the West, as we run up to the presidential election in the United States, ends up by putting some sort of pressure on Zelensky to reach a settlement, which obviously would mean Russia on Ukrainian territory.
That's right. It should be totally unsatisfactory. So
that doesn't necessarily mean it won't happen. May I ask you about the Voice referendum that was held in Australia? A couple of weeks ago, Tim Smith was sitting where you were, and he gave us a view. What's it done to Australian politics? How do you stand now?
Well, I think the no vote, which was about 60%, was a huge rebuke to the elites in Australia.
Right.
This was a referendum that was driven from the top down. I was on the no side. My seat recorded the highest no vote in Western Australia. I had 76.5 of my constituency vote no. It's a working class seat, a bit like the red wall seats here in the UK. A massive rebuke to the elites. They had the support of big tech with favourable algorithms for yes. They had big finance, the banks on their side. They had big sport, all the major sporting codes supporting it. They had big business. They had big unions. It was the big guy versus the little guy. In fact, if you look at the money, the No campaign spent about $15.5 million. The Yes campaign had more than $50 million. And still, the Australian people have had enough of identity politics. They've had enough of being divided. And the people I spoke to who voted no were voting for a unified Australia, where race and ancestry doesn't matter. We're all equal before the law.
It's quite funny because you expect people in politics to learn lessons. You know, I was in favour of Brexit. And I wasn't all that hopeful during the referendum campaign. But my hopes got up when I saw this coalition of forces, the sort that you've described. And here it was also the banks. I mean, the banks, for heaven's sake, after the banking rush, the banks were telling us that we ought to remain in the European Union. And I think the little guy said here, well, if all those people are lined up and think that we should remain in the European Union, I want to do the opposite. So maybe you had a similar effect.
Yeah, and I hope they're chastened by this because they'll send their government relations people to Parliament and start lobbying for favourable policies and they might get a cold shoulder for some time.